I'm so glad that we are finally kicking off this seminar series with Dr. Divya Karnad today. I just want to say that this is a very weird semester and we're not all used to this mode of instruction, but we're very happy that Dr. Divya Karnad could join us today from India. So Dr. Divya Karnad has completed her PhD in geography from Rutgers, and she also has a master's in wildlife biology and conservation. Her work is truly interdisciplinary. Um, it's mainly on, she mainly advocates for sustainable fishing, and her work on threatened sharks as well as responsible seafood consumption has enabled her to be the first Indian woman to win the prestigious Global Future for Nature Award. And I remember meeting Divya for the first time on her project when I was 18 and being inspired by her till today. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you, Divya. Thank you so much for joining us today. I just have one housekeeping request. Just if you could keep your audio off the entire time, that would help. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat during the talk, and we will address it in the question and answer session. Welcome to a new semester, and over to you, Divya.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me. My internet is not the best, but let's see how things go. So maybe I will start directly by sharing my screen. Yes, and I hope that this presentation is now visible. Okay, great. Yeah, so today I will be talking about an issue that faces the entire world's fisheries, but specifically looking at it from what's happening in India. And I think one of the largest issues that's facing the fisheries is, of course, climate change that is affecting all marine ecosystems. But I think one of the other big issues that everyone's been talking about is the issue of overfishing. And this is something that has gone beyond the scientific community. There are documentaries made about it. Policymakers in the EU are talking about it. Cartoonists are making cartoons about it. And it's something that is far beyond the scope of just science anymore. And the reason for this is because people feel like there are too many fishermen and too few fish left in the sea. The science tells us that our fish catches basically peaked across the world, peaked in the early 90s, early to mid 90s. And this is a pattern that is mirrored by India's fish catches, where our fish catches also peaked in the early to mid 90s. But India's fish catches, at least the wild catches, have seen quite a large decline since then. And of course, our farmed fish are exploding. But as a result of these huge declines in India's fish catches, the government agency of India, which is responsible for collecting data on how much fish is left in the ocean, says that now 84% of our fish stocks are either depleted or fully exploited. And what this means is that we can't afford to really continue fishing at this rate anymore, except for about 16% of our fish catch. And this is not really a good thing because seafood demand is still on the increase, both in India and across the world. And India supplies the world market for seafood. So this is definitely something to be concerned about. Given this scenario, I think everyone has been wondering how India is going to tackle it. And of course, the first thing that you think about is government regulation. And in India, we have the Indian Fisheries Act, which is a colonial era policy, which is sort of a legacy thing. But basically all it does is devolve authority to the state, to the different coastal states of India to then enact laws at the state level. The result of this is that state fisheries laws don't really match each other. And so there is no uniform policy that operates across India's waters. And the only thing that sort of all these states have in common is the fact that many of their regulations are aimed at reducing conflict between different sectors of the fishery. So by and large, we can divide the fishery into a small scale sector and a large scale mechanized sector. And there is a lot of conflict between these two sectors. And so that's what, for the most part, these laws address. So I'll just give you a few examples. So there is something called an exclusive artisanal zone, which is what you see in the deep blue on the map, right alongside India's coastline. And this exclusive artisanal zone is an area where only small scale fishers, that is non-motorized and also small motorized boats, are allowed to operate in terms of fishing, and all mechanized vessels like the large purse seines and trawl vessels, which have hydraulic equipment to lay the fishing gear and pull it out of the water, those are technically illegal to be using these near shore waters. Now, even this is not consistent through all the states. Some states have larger artisanal zones than others, but at least it's there all across the country. So that's one good thing. Another feature is that some states ban night fishing. So they particularly want to prevent large vessels from operating at night, just because some of the smaller fishermen who go out don't have any lights on, and it results in a lot of accidents and possibly death. So again, this is like a conflict resolution mechanism more than a sustainability mechanism. And it's not something that all states have implemented. So if one state implements it, more often than not, the state right adjacent to it does not implement this. And so it results in a lot of legal loopholes and allows for a lot of things to go on that do not actually result in either preventing conflict or in sustainability. So given this scenario, I am quite skeptical about how good law will be in terms of being able to regulate Indian fisheries. But an additional reason why I'm a bit skeptical about the government's ability to really control the fisheries is because Indian fisheries often look like this. So this is an example of one of our so-called large-scale mechanized fishing harbors. This houses about 3,000 vessels, all crammed into this really small area. And there are hundreds of thousands of people who then visit this area to to sell fish, to trade in it, distribute it, etc. And so I don't think you can even imagine what it's like to be in this area. And I think you might well understand that these areas have been COVID hotspots. But trying to figure out exactly what was caught, how much of it, and so on in a fishing harbor that looks like this is next to impossible. And what makes it worse is that this is not the majority of how fishing is done in India, because the majority looks like this. Small scale fishermen who have beach landing boats, who can just basically go fish and bring the boats back to the beaches in front of their villages. And since India has a 7,500 kilometer long coastline, having beach landing crafts across this entire coastline, I would say makes it impossible to monitor what's happening with Indian fisheries. So given this whole set of things, I began to ask questions about how exactly India's fisheries could be made sustainable. So today I'm just going to talk about 3 research questions that I have asked over quite some time, and try and walk you through what made me actually start some kind of conservation intervention. So my first question was, can state regulations actually result in sustained seafood supplies? And given that I'm so skeptical about it, I then asked, are there more effective ways to sustainably regulate our fisheries? And to what extent does regulating only the fisheries actually result in more ecologically sustainable marine environments? So let's start with the first one about the role of the state. To understand this, my colleagues and I conducted surveys with fishermen, both on the East Coast and the West Coast of India. Overall, we spoke to 352 different fishermen from different boats, and most of them were between 20 and 45 years old. And just to give you some background of the type of people we were talking to, most did not have much of an education. At the most, they had elementary level education, and many were completely illiterate. They spent between 50 and 335 days at sea. The lower end of the spectrum was seen on the West Coast, while the higher end of the spectrum was seen on the East Coast of India. And then I looked at policies that the state had implemented in each of these places. And on the West Coast, I saw an alternation between trying to incentivize large-scale mechanized fishing and trying to regulate it. So in 1978, they provided loans to buy bottom trawling vessels. I'm not sure whether you know what those are. Those are basically drag nets with an auto board in front or some kind of a cement block in front, which is dragged through the seabed so that it suspends all the sediment into the water. And the net that comes behind this board basically catches whatever has been suspended in the water column. And these are mostly used to catch shrimp and prawn. And the aim of doing this is largely for export. So these are now known to be some of the most destructive fishing methods in the world. And yet they continued to be promoted in 1978, in 1988, and 1995, and so on. Finally, in 1997, they shifted to trying to promote offshore vessels in terms of per scene technology. And again, you see in 1999, there were restrictions. So there's this complete alternation between incentivizing something and then trying to restrict it. While on the East Coast, the restrictions were all upfront. They were in the 1970s and 80s. And since then, it's only been schemes and subsidies to incentivize mechanized fishing. So in terms of what the fishermen told us, what we see here is where people fished. And what is in blue is the area used by fishermen from the East Coast, and what is in orange is the area used by the mechanized fishermen where we actually did the study, the districts there. And typically when fishing vessels are licensed from these districts, they are only licensed to operate in the waters surrounding those districts. As you can see clearly, no one's following those rules. And what you see in the brown is the exclusive artisanal zone. And what you see marked by the black boundary is the area where the small scale or artisanal fishers were actually fishing. So when we spoke to the artisanal fishers, they said that they never used the exclusive artisanal zone because it was so crowded with the large scale mechanized vessels who were fishing there illegally. And this was something that was confirmed by the large scale mechanized vessel owners because they apparently did not face any consequences for fishing there illegally. So all of these fishermen were doing all of these strange things and fishing all over the place. And we wanted to know why. And their response was that they perceived huge declines in fish catch as compared to the previous generations of fishermen. I'm not sure how real these declines are because we haven't measured it per capita, but at least this is their perception. And in response to their perception, people on the East Coast, which is the column on the extreme right, spent more time fishing and fished over larger areas, while people on the West Coast, for the most part, changed the fishing gear and changed their targets. And All of these things in one way or the other were illegal according to the state laws at that time. So I was really wondering how this was just blatantly occurring without any kind of government intervention. So my next step was to speak to people from the state fisheries departments about these law breaking and other issues. And when I spoke to them, they told me 100% of them told me that they thought their role was only to provide subsidies and develop the fisheries towards being more productive and increasing fish catches, no matter what the cost. And when I asked specifically about implementing the limiting the regulations of the law, the like 75% of these fishermen felt that they just wanted to avoid any kind of conflict. I'm sorry, 75% of the fisheries officers wanted to avoid any conflict with the fishermen. And as a result of this, they were not implementing those sides of the law that involved trying to restrict what the fishermen were doing. So given this situation, in terms of answering my question about the role of the state, it definitely seems like the state is trying to enable technological change, but the kind of change that they are enabling is towards the most ecologically destructive fishing method. And the kind of subsidies that they were providing were only partial subsidies. And fishermen in India do not have access to any other forms of formal credit, like they don't have access to banks. So by using these partial subsidies, the fishermen were automatically being forced to get the rest of the money from money lenders. And money lenders in India can charge interest rates up to 60%. So this was just pushing the entire fishing community into debt. And when they were in debt, they were not interested in complying with legislation or being bothered about sustainability, but it seemed like they were more interested in just servicing this debt no matter what. So it seemed like if we had to go the state route and we had to ask the state to implement its own legislations, they would need a humongous investment in surveillance and monitoring, something that I don't think India is capable of at the moment. So given the situation, I wondered whether there were any alternatives, whether any other forms of regulations could occur. And to answer this question, I looked specifically at the West and did some more qualitative and ethnographic work in the Sindhudurg district, which is the southernmost district of Maharashtra state, and then went ahead and surveyed fishermen across the district and across the region to figure out whether what I found in that district applied elsewhere. So some of the work that I did there was to actually stay close to the fishermen and participate in many of their meetings and so on. And this is a picture from one of these meetings where the fishermen were talking about having their own fishing territory. And a fishing territory was this area of waters that was adjacent to several of these villages that had come together, and they sort of wanted to maintain control of it. Now, this of course was entirely illegal because the Indian law does not recognize such fishing territories, but the fishermen had decided to do this anyway because they felt like the lack of regulation was pushing fisheries to an extent where they were losing control and they were sure that fisheries would not last into the future. So in terms of thinking about sustainability, the fishermen were already doing it. And they were implementing various types of techniques and practices that are internationally recognized as being very pro-sustainability. So things like spatial closures, temporal closures, where they would close it for some season or they would close it for night fishing, and also bans on certain types of fishing gear. And the result of this was that they were catching whatever was ecologically available at the time rather than chasing after high value species. And so then I went on to ask whether these kinds of regimes existed elsewhere in the region, and I found it to be quite common across the entire region. So overall, these sort of management regimes had a similar structure. They had a head village and also supporting villages participated in maintaining a single fishing territory. And they seemed to meet in temples or other places of worship. And the effect of this was similar to placing your hand on a Bible in a court, because they felt like people would have to answer to a higher authority if they were speaking in a temple. And most of the decisions were based on consensus, except where the groups were really large, and then it was based on majority. And as I said before, they made decisions about what gear could be used, which spaces could be used, and what time fishing was allowed. And when someone went against these rules, they had a whole range of ways to punish them and prevent this from happening again, which ranged from, a bunch of village elders just visiting a person in their home and sort of dressing them down there, to actual social ostracism where no one would talk to people, closing down markets to people so that they would really be put to a lot of difficulty to try and find other markets for their catch, and also levying fines on them. Last step, if none of these things worked, was violence, and they would resort to violence whenever they were unable to make any of these other punishments work. So given these situations, I found that it seemed like they were managing commons. And I don't know if you've heard about the Nobel Prize winning work of Elinor Ostrom, but she has identified all these characteristic rules of the commons. And I found that these village fishing territories sort of matched some of those rules. So they had locally adapted rules for usage and maintenance. And there was a lot of local participation in decision making and monitoring. And this is something that is not very easy to do in India, because there are a lot of different languages, and there's this whole difficulty of going from wherever you stay to the nearest port or other decision making place in order to participate. So having it at the local level within the fishing community, speaking in the local dialect and so on, was a real opportunity for everyone to participate. And having graduated sanctions and cheap conflict resolution was another important way in which these commons management systems sort of matched what Elinor Ostrom was talking about. So overall, it seemed like this community level management was really good in terms of managing the fishery. It offered opportunities for everyone to access decision making. It prioritized local ecological knowledge and their concern for the environment. And it also showed me that these fishermen were willing to make economic sacrifices in terms of not using the most cutting edge technology for fishing and so on, in order to benefit the entire community. And as a result of this, they were producing ecologically driven seafood harvests, which in India means that they were catching a huge diversity of fish, and not only trying to chase after the most high value species. And they were also, by practicing fishing that in a way that was constantly checking up on their fishing gears, not soaking their nets for too long, they were also reducing bycatch of species that are threatened or are illegal to catch in India, by checking their nets and by modifying where they place them every time they were catching something that they didn't want to. But it's not all rosy. Communities cannot be the answer to everything. And so I also wanted to talk about where these communities fail. One problem is that they were operating at this real micro scale, and it wasn't really easy to scale up this kind of management to larger scales where the state could get involved. Second was that it was quite repressive to the outsiders who did not participate. So for example, people who came in from other states or fishing vessels from other countries, because the villagers didn't know how to deal with them, it would almost typically devolve into violence. So that was not an ideal situation. And it required continuous reinforcement to remain effective, because every time someone said, why are we doing this? Why are we taking all this pain? Let's just switch and start using the most cutting edge technology. They would have to sit together as a group and get consensus again about maintaining the status quo. So these were some of the issues, but I think over time, what became apparent is that even if they were able to address these kinds of issues, they were unable to maintain these systems in the long term because they did not have supportive markets. And this is something that fishermen repeatedly told me, that even if they caught ecologically driven harvests, the market still demanded only the high value species. So they kept asking me why scientists and conservationists would only come to fishermen and ask them to be sustainable, while no one was talking about market incentives and how the market was driving the fisheries. So to really understand this, I then began to ask, to what extent does regulating only fisheries actually create a sustainable marine environment? And to answer this question, I conducted, along with my colleagues, conducted surveys with self-identified ethical seafood consumers across 4 large cities in India. And the reason that we chose these large cities was because previous research had told us that these are very important markets for India's fisheries. And also the COVID experience, I think, has kind of reinforced that, because when these cities shut down, closed their borders during the 1-month lockdown that we had in India from the end of March to about the end of April, India's fisheries were in chaos, because if they actually fished at the rate that they were, usually they were producing too much fish for local markets. And so without being able to send markets to these metro cities, the fisheries were just in chaos. So that's why we chose these areas. In addition to that, we surveyed 400 seafood restaurants across these metros, and we are in the process of conducting ethnographies to understand how these seafood markets work and also how demand works. So what we found was that from my work in the fisheries, it seemed like people were catching 80 to 100 edible species every day. And by edible species, I mean, teleost fish, which are not threatened and not illegal to catch, and were traditionally part of cuisine in India. And but on average, people in these cities who identified as being ethical and responsible consumers were eating only about 6.1 species groups. So here I use the word species groups because sometimes people could not distinguish between certain very similar species. And so if we pass out the species groups, I think at the most you would get about 10 to 15 species. And I think, as any student knows, having 15 out of a possible 80 or 100 is technically a fail grade. And I think this is what Indian seafood consumers are doing. They're failing our fisheries. On average, they were willing to try only 2.5 more types of species groups. So even that is not very much. And 1/3 of the respondents had absolutely no knowledge about seafood harvest methods or the impacts of different methods. 54%, which is the majority, were unaware about the number of edible species that were harvested across India. They thought that there were only a few. And we found similar patterns across restaurants. On average, again, it was about 6 species, and the two boxes on the left represent cities that are inland, while the 2 boxes on the right represent cities that are coastal. And even though we hypothesized that coastal cities should technically feature more diversity, this wasn't the case. Only Mumbai showed slightly more diversity, but unfortunately this was explained by a lot of non-Indian species like Vietnamese basa and Norwegian salmon and caviar and things like that. And so it didn't really differ from the rest in terms of species diversity. So these were all sort of indicators for my intervention, because I realized that these high priority urban markets are completely out of sync with the ecological realities of sustainable fishing. And it was a clear indication that it was not enough to only talk to the fishermen and try to regulate fisheries, but one needed to work at multiple scales and work across the supply chain. So there was a clear need for supportive markets for fisheries management. And while fishing commons is a possible solution, it cannot work alone. So this is why I got together with some colleagues and started an initiative called In Season Fish. So this is a sustainable seafood initiative that works across the east and west coasts of India and works across multiple scales. The most basic thing that we do is to create awareness among seafood consumers about the fact that we have such a huge diversity of possible species that they could eat, as well as the fact that these species are wild, and so they have different breeding seasons. And technically, one should avoid eating a species during its breeding season if you want to eat that species the next year. And so we provide advisories like this, where the months of the year are marked on the top, while the green and red bars tell you when you can eat the species or not. So when it's green, you can eat it, and when it's red, you can't. And on the sides, we have some of the most commonly eaten species in certain parts of India. So we do this kind of awareness through social media and so on, but most of our work actually is on the ground, working with different stakeholders in the fisheries. So another thing we do is work with restaurants, because we saw that restaurants were also an important player in helping people choose different types of seafood. So again, the most basic thing we do here is create awareness by providing these kinds of awareness materials within the restaurant. But beyond this, we have gone ahead and started working with restaurants in terms of putting their procurement teams in touch with the small scale fishermen who participate in these fishing commons, and trying to get them to source a part or the entirety of their seafood supply from these people. One of the restaurants that we work with had got so inspired by this that they actually went ahead and hired someone from the local fishing community to be their procurement agent for seafood. And so then they were assured of getting more sustainable seafood for the entirety of what they sold at the restaurant. But while working with these restaurants and chefs, what we realized is that a lot of people do not know much about what's happening with India's fisheries. And unfortunately, the culinary institutions where all these chefs are being trained don't provide much information about indigenous ingredients. They are mainly taught about Western and other cuisines, but they are not taught much about Indian food. So we actually started training people at these culinary institutes and taking them out to these fishing harbors and fish landing sites to help them learn how to identify species, how to look at different fishing methods and realize what is more sustainable. Luckily for us, the more sustainable methods also produce the fresher seafood. And so a lot of chefs who learned about this were really inspired to then start visiting these sites for themselves and start choosing their seafood. And in addition to that, we also take the general public out to just teach them about how to go to fish markets and buy fish, because this seems to be a skill that people are losing. What questions to ask of fish sellers in order to figure out whether your seafood has been caught sustainably. And overall, we provide these kinds of trainings across the coastline. We have done this in many different cities. And we have been working with many different institutions that provide training to chefs. So ultimately, beneath all of this talk of sustainable seafood, my personal interest is the fact that creating these kinds of sustainable fisheries at the end of the day benefit not just the species that we eat, but also threatened species. By trying to support fisheries that reduce bycatch, we are benefiting all the sea turtles and seahorses and whale sharks and other things that people are not supposed to catch, as well as all the other threatened species that are simply being caught by these unsustainable methods and then being discarded or used for very low value products. So our aim in this is to create some kind of a market intervention to ensure not only ocean health, but also people's health. And we believe that all of these things are very much integrated and needed if one has to actually achieve marine conservation. So I think I'll stop here, and I would encourage you to look us up on social media and also to check our website, which is inseasonfish.com, to just see the kind of work that we are doing. And in case I can't answer any questions today, I would be happy to take your questions over email. So I will stop here and maybe keep myself open for questions.
I've sent a message to everyone in the group chat. So please enter your questions and comments for the speaker in the chat box. We'll wait a couple of minutes for these to pour in.
Sure.
I also just want to add that on the In-Season Fish social media accounts, they share a lot of local Indian recipes on how to cook indigenous fish. And I've actually tried some of those on the fish here, and they're not so bad.
Okay, great. I feel like maybe I stunned everyone into silence.
I mean, Zoom is a strange platform. I don't think everyone is used to it. It's different from like an in-room experience. Oh, we have a question here from Caroline. Was there pushback on compliance from anyone when you were trying to start in-season fish?
I think the most resistance that we've faced has been from the traders. The restaurants were really keen on this idea of, not farm to table, but whatever, net to table, if you want to call it that. But the traders were that we tried to engage with to ask them to feature more diversity and also feature seasonal fish. At least the large ones who operate across India have been a little bit resistant to this idea. So instead, we are now focusing our attention on some of the smaller players, and we're hoping that if a critical mass of them change, then maybe the larger players will be more incentivized to change also.
We have another question.
My research.
Sorry, what were you saying, Divya?
Oh, I was just reading the question out loud.
Yeah. We have a question from Sue Galatovich. What are the next steps for your research?
Yeah, so now the next thing that we realized is that a lot of people are sort of switching now from marine seafood to farmed fish, because they feel like that is the way forward. And if marine environments sort of run out of fish, they feel like the farms will still have fish in them. Except that in India, at least, I think most of our farmed fish are fed with fish meal that is made from marine fish. So it's not like these things are completely independent. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. So the next step is to start understanding these connections between the marine fisheries and aquaculture or farmed fish, and to try and figure out to what extent the marine fisheries are sort of subsidizing uh, fish farming.
We have another question. In most of the fishing conducted via net, that is trawl, purseine or gillnet, what proportion is long line, and how does this vary depending on industrial versus artisanal, and how does this vary for bycatch? It's a loaded question.
Yeah. Yeah, so the trawl fishery has been incentivized since the 1970s. So that is one common way in which people fish. The gill nets are also a really common way in which all the small scale fishermen fish. And just in terms of population, the small scale fishermen are the majority. So that's pretty much what you will see if you go anywhere to India's coast. You will see a lot of gill nets and also a lot of trawls. The purse scenes are much more recent. They've been introduced only in the 90s and since then. So while those are sort of developing fisheries, they are not exactly the most common yet. Long lines, for the most part, are restricted to deep water fishing. And this typically happens on the islands offshore from India. But while the government is trying to promote this at the moment, it's not yet quite common way to fish in India. And in terms of bycatch, I think the biggest culprit would be the trawl fishery, but also the gillnet fishery that is used by small scale fishermen if they don't check their nets often.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. In these fisheries, are there cases in which fish catch size is decreasing and fishing is selecting for smaller and smaller individuals? If so, is fishing gear, example mesh size, regulated in response?
Yeah, so I think there have been a few studies that have looked at this, but it isn't enough information scientifically to have a clear answer. What has been studied is that there is definitely evidence of fishing down the food chain. But in terms of fish catch sizes, I think there have just been a couple of species for which this has been demonstrated. And in terms of mesh size regulations, we have them in many states already. It's just that, like I said in the beginning, none of it is enforced.
Okay. We have a lot more questions. What is the response of the government, fisheries administrators or biologists to your research and involvement in fisheries management? Do they appreciate your work, or do they feel like you are interfering?
So I think biologists are quite appreciative for the most part, because I think what the fishing villages are doing pretty much falls along the lines of what biologists have been recommending for a long time. The fisheries administrators are, I would say, not so interested in this, because their goal, as they stated clearly, was to develop the fisheries and move to more export-oriented fishing. But having said that, there are definitely individuals within the administration who have been very positive and very receptive. And they have tried to then talk to their colleagues about this kind of work. But I think working with government in India is quite a slow process. And since this is work that we've only been doing for a few years now, I think it's going to take at least a decade, if not longer, to see any changes from the government side.
Okay. Another question. Curious about the Indian Fisheries Act you mentioned in the beginning. Is there any chance of broader legislative change in India related to fisheries that could support the work you're doing with sustainability?
Yeah, so I think even the fish workers have come together to ask for these kinds of changes at the federal level. So, for instance, they've been asking for a unique ministry of fisheries that will regulate what's happening in the fisheries, because right now the fisheries are regulated by the Ministry of Agriculture. And of course, agriculture and fisheries are two completely different things. And I think they've already made progress in this respect, because the present government has announced that there will be a unique ministry created. And I think it's still in progress. So let's see what happens with that.
Another question we have is, were there any population estimates for the fishery in the artisanal zone to more directly examine how local regulations affect the population? If not, is there a plan to monitor these populations going forward?
Yeah, so we don't have any biological data to support the use of these fishing territories. What we do have only is perceptions, and the people who participate in those fishing territories perceive that they are catching the same amounts of fish that they were a decade ago or more. But and this is different from the perceptions of those fishing outside. But beyond that, unfortunately, we don't have any biological data. It's pretty difficult to monitor these populations without the state's involvement, because we need, I think, a lot of resources to do that. So this is something that I think a couple of non-government organizations are trying to work on, where they are trying to create partnerships with the state to start monitoring these populations.
Okay. We have a question. What is aquaculture like in India overall? Is it small and local producers, or are there larger operations? And are these land-based or net pens in open water?
Yeah, so we have a mix of both small and large scale operations, but primarily these are land-based, and they've only started open water aquaculture in the last couple of years, because there was a lot of legal issues surrounding this until now. And what it's like is that usually the pens are overfilled, and as a result there is a very high antibiotic load in all these aquaculture shrimp that are particularly exported to the US and the EU. So please beware of the shrimp that you're eating. Yeah, I think that's all I want to say.
Thank you for that. The next question is, earlier you mentioned that fishermen catch many more species than people typically eat. Do fishermen typically release these species, or do they sell them for agricultural fertilizers or animal food?
Yeah, so there is a small local market for these diverse varieties that people eat. So coastal communities still eat the variety that they catch, but I think everyone else in cities has stopped doing that. And there is a huge market now for fertilizer and animal feed. And so most of the stuff that doesn't get sold in cities ends up being sold to these other low value supply chains.
Okay. And we have a follow-up question to that. Have you looked at the substitution of seafood products, that is low value species being processed and marketed as high value species?
So there is a lot of mixing up of species. But the problem is that it's difficult to call them low value species, because typically large fish are substituted for other large fish, but most large fish already have a high-ish value in the market. But there is a lot of substitution, and there are also kind of blatant, I don't know. So for instance, when people sell sharks, shark meat is a really traditional form of medicine that is given to certain people at certain times in their lives. And there is one particular species that is intended as the medicine, which is designated as least concern by IUCN, which is called the milk shark. But people keep selling hammerhead sharks and calling them milk sharks. And I think if you've seen a hammerhead shark, you know that it has a hammer on its head. And so it looks very different from any other kind of shark. People just accept it. Like they see the whole shark with the hammer and they're told that oh, this is called a milk shark. And they're just like, okay, this is a milk shark. And then they just buy it. So yeah, so some of the substitution is very blatant while others are more hidden.
And to what extent do local fishing communities have direct access to restaurants and similar market endpoints?
This has been quite an issue in most areas except maybe in Kerala, where I think there's been a lot more work to connect fishing communities to restaurants. And I think in general, the fishing community there is maybe slightly more empowered. But in other places, there isn't much connection. So this is the work that we are trying to do to connect these people and put them in contact in order to create more transparent supply chains, basically. So this will, of course, work in coastal areas and not necessarily work in inland areas. So we still have to figure out a plan for inland cities. But at least in coastal areas, they should know what's happening in the fisheries and they should be directly in contact with the fishermen is what we feel. So what we're trying to do.
I think we have time for a couple of questions. So we have one more. Has the recent increase in shrimp aquaculture in India resulted in a decreased pressure on wild-caught shrimp?
Unfortunately, not really, because while the original intention of having these bottom trawl vessels was to catch only wild-caught shrimp, they've now sort of been repurposed to catch a whole bunch of other species. And in fact, the work by a scientist who was from the University of Cambridge, Aaron Lobo, he found that now most of these trawl fisheries intended for shrimp are actually focusing on the animal feed and fertilizer market. So their main aim now is to catch what we would call bycatch in order to feed this fertilizer and animal feed market.
Thank you for answering all the questions. This is like a rapid fire round. And thank you so much. If there are no more questions, I'll just go ahead and wrap up the session by saying thank you to Dr. Divya Karnar for joining us at this inconvenient hour for her. But we are so happy we could have you today. And do head over to her social media channels and email her if you have any questions or collaborations in mind. Thank you, everyone, and have a good weekend.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
We just have closing comments of thank yous and a bunch of claps.
Okay.